October 12, 1972. 75 miles off the coast of North Vietnam, the aircraft carrier USS Kitty Hawk was launching bombing runs against enemy targets when violence erupted below deck. For 6 hours, sailors armed with chains, pipes, and makeshift weapons fought throughout the ship's passageways. When it ended, more than 50 sailors lay injured. Within weeks, 25 black sailors faced court-martial on charges of rioting and assault. Not a single white sailor was charged. What the Navy called a mutiny was actually something else entirely. The breaking point of men pushed too far by systematic racism in America's most segregated military branch. This is the story of how the United States Navy prosecuted the victims and protected the perpetrators, and how 50 years later, the truth finally emerged from 5 boxes a lawyer couldn't bring himself to throw away. The USS Kitty Hawk was a floating city of contradictions in 1972. Launched in 1960 as one of the largest warships ever built, the supercarrier stretched nearly a quarter-mile long and carried 4,400 sailors and airmen. Among them were approximately 300 black sailors, just 7% of the crew, serving in what remained America's most racially hostile military branch. While the Army and Air Force had begun addressing their racial problems in the late 1960s, the Navy lagged years behind. The service had what officers euphemistically called traditions. Black sailors knew them by different names: systematic discrimination, institutional racism, and a rigid caste system that kept them trapped in the ship's worst jobs. The numbers told the story. Of the 348 officers aboard Kitty Hawk, only 5 were black, barely 1%. Black enlisted sailors found themselves overwhelmingly assigned to the lowest rates, the Navy's ranking system for enlisted personnel. They worked as mess attendants, boatswain's mates, and deckhands, performing the ship's most menial and degrading tasks, while white sailors of equal or lesser ability advanced past them. The discrimination wasn't subtle. When black sailors committed infractions, they faced harsh punishment at captain's mast, the Navy's non-judicial disciplinary system. White sailors committing identical offenses received minimal consequences or walked away with warnings. The pattern was so consistent, so documented, that even the ship's own records would later reveal the disparity. One case that would emerge during investigations captured the double standard perfectly. When black sailors assaulted white sailors, sentences ranged from 3 days confinement on bread and water to 30 days confinement to court-martial referral, followed by undesirable discharge. When white sailors assaulted black sailors, in one case, an outright dismissal of charges, in another, a $25 fine. This wasn't just about discipline. Black sailors found themselves systematically denied the recommendations needed for advancement. They scored lower on tests not because of ability, but because of educational opportunities they'd been denied in a still segregated America. When they sought better assignments, they hit walls built by white officers who viewed them as incapable of anything beyond manual labor. The frustration was compounded by what black sailors faced when the ship made port. At Subic Bay Naval Base in the Philippines, the main liberty port for ships operating off Vietnam, racial segregation was openly enforced. The white section of town was known as the Strip. The black section was called the Jungle. This was 1972, 8 years after the Civil Rights Act, and American military personnel were still being directed to racially segregated areas by their own chain of command. By October 1972, Kitty Hawk had been at sea for 8 months, far longer than normal. The crew was exhausted from the grueling pace of combat flight operations. They'd been told they were going home. Then came the order: stay in Vietnam for additional missions. The disappointment hit everyone hard. For black sailors, already operating under tremendous stress from constant discrimination, it pushed them closer to a breaking point they'd been approaching for months. The powder keg began smoking on October 8, 1972, while Kitty Hawk was docked at Subic Bay. That evening at the Enlisted Men's Club, a black sailor went on stage and shouted what many black Americans were thinking about the war. This war is the white man's war. Someone threw a glass that hit him in the head. A fight broke out between black and white sailors, spilling out into the street. Around 12:30 a.m. on October 9th, another incident occurred when Black Airman Dwight Horton was arrested for fighting with two white petty officers. Horton contested that they had beaten him, arguing he couldn't fight back because his arm was in a cast. When he returned to the Kitty Hawk and told other black sailors what happened, it further agitated tensions that were already explosive. The pattern continued over the next few days. On September 13th, several black sailors reported being assaulted by Filipino locals at the instigation of white sailors. The ship's chain of command did nothing. Black sailors were learning a bitter lesson. They could expect no protection from their officers, no justice from their system, no relief from the harassment that followed them from ship to shore and back again. Then came the afternoon of October 12th. While Kitty Hawk was participating in Operation Linebacker off the coast of North Vietnam, black sailor Perry Pettus went on deck with two other black sailors. They were approached by two Marines who told them, "You blacks can't walk in over twos." When the black sailors ignored them and kept walking, Pettus was put into a stranglehold from behind with a nightstick by one of the Marines. This wasn't discipline. This was targeting. Marines had been ordered to break up groups of 3 or more sailors, but as would later be testified under oath, they only enforced this order against black sailors. White sailors could gather in groups as large as they wanted without harassment. That evening, the breaking point arrived in the most mundane way possible. 18-year-old black airman apprentice Terry Avenger wanted 2 sandwiches from the mess line. The white mess cook, James Radford, told him he was only allowed 1. Avenger reached across the food line and grabbed an extra sandwich. A shouting match ensued. Within minutes, tensions that had been building for months, for years, for generations, exploded throughout the ship. What happened next would be characterized by the Navy and Congress as unprovoked black violence. The reality, as would emerge decades later, was far more complex and damning to the chain of command. Around 10 p.m., groups of black sailors began moving through the ship's passageways. Some were looking for specific white sailors who had been harassing them. Others were responding to rumors that white sailors were hunting black crew members. The violence spread quickly through the ship's narrow corridors. Sailors fought with whatever they could grab: chains, wrenches, broom handles, pieces of pipe. When the mob found James Radford, the mess attendant who had refused Avenger a second sandwich, they attacked him with particular fury. But here's what the initial investigations failed to document, what the Navy didn't want to acknowledge. White sailors were also roaming the ship in groups, armed and attacking black sailors. Commander Benjamin Cloud, the ship's executive officer and one of only 5 black officers aboard, was watching a movie when the violence erupted. As he moved through the ship trying to restore order, he witnessed something the official narrative would try to erase. Cloud later testified under oath that he saw white sailors directing Marines toward black sailors, coordinating attacks while remaining in the background. Cloud himself became a target. When he first engaged the angry mob of black sailors, they were shouting to kill him or throw him overboard. In an attempt to calm the crowd, Cloud held up a clenched fist, the Black Power salute, and began talking. For hours, he worked to de-escalate the situation, while violence continued throughout the ship. Around 2:30 a.m., Cloud finally acquired control over the main group of black sailors. He calmed them down, had them put their weapons at his feet or over the side, and ordered them to return to their compartments. The violence aboard Kitty Hawk had ended after 6 hours of chaos. Approximately 50 sailors were treated for injuries that night. All but 6 were white. This became a central piece of the Navy's narrative. Black sailors had run amok, attacking innocent white crew members in an unprovoked racial rampage. But the medical reports told only part of the story. They documented who received treatment from the ship's medical facilities. They didn't document the black sailors who chose not to report their injuries, knowing that doing so would make them targets for retaliation. They didn't capture the reality that Commander Cloud had witnessed. This had been mutual combat, with white sailors actively participating in the violence. The next morning, something remarkable happened. The ship didn't skip a beat. The flight deck was launching combat sorties on schedule, as if nothing had occurred. For the next 28 days, Kitty Hawk continued around-the-clock combat flight operations, racking up a record 177 days of combat operations. Below deck, however, a very different kind of operation was underway. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Marv Townsend, ordered an investigation. What followed was a masterclass in institutional bias. The Naval Investigative Service interviewed sailors about what had happened on October 12th. Almost all of those interviews were with white crew members. Virtually no statements were taken from black sailors, even though many had been injured. Article 31 warnings, the military equivalent of Miranda rights, were given to black sailors being questioned. Not a single white sailor received an Article 31 warning during the investigation. From the very beginning, the Navy had decided who the suspects were and who the victims were. The fact that Commander Cloud had witnessed white sailors participating in the violence was ignored. The documented history of racial harassment aboard the ship was dismissed as irrelevant. The systematic discrimination in discipline that the ship's own records revealed was never mentioned. By late October 1972, Captain Townsend had charged 25 black sailors with assault, and 21 of them with rioting. He referred all but one to special courts-martial. This was unprecedented in several ways. It was the first time the Navy had tried such a large number of defendants together. It was the first time sailors had ever been charged with rioting. It was the first time a large group of defendants was locked up in the brig for months before their trials. No white crew members were charged. Not one. Not the Marines who had selectively enforced the no-gathering rule against black sailors. Not the white sailors Commander Cloud had seen coordinating attacks. Not the white crew members who had participated in the violence at Subic Bay days earlier. When Kitty Hawk returned to San Diego on November 28, 1972, 284 days away from home, a reporter from the New York Times asked sailors debarking what the trouble had been aboard the ship. They yelled back a one-word response: racism. The trials that followed would become a national story, exposing ugly truths about the state of racial relations in the United States military. The special courts-martial of the black crew members were held at the San Diego Naval Station Law Center over several months in early 1973. Daily television reports covered the proceedings. Articles flowed from newspapers and news magazines throughout the country. Headlines trumpeted references to the USS Kitty Hawk race riot. Some even characterized it erroneously as the first mutiny in the history of the modern United States Navy. Among the Navy JAG lawyers assigned to defend the accused was 27-year-old Lieutenant Marv Truhe from South Dakota. Truhe had handled more than 200 courts-martial in his 2 years of service, but nothing had prepared him for what he discovered when he began meeting with his clients. The Navy's case rested heavily on testimony from white sailors describing unprovoked attacks by black crew members. But as Truhe dug into the evidence, contradictions emerged. Sailors who claimed to have witnessed specific incidents couldn't keep their stories straight. Details changed between initial statements and trial testimony. Most troubling, virtually none of the prosecution's witnesses had been warned about self-incrimination, meaning they'd given statements without understanding they could refuse to answer questions. The congressional investigation that began in December 1972 was no better. The House Special Subcommittee on Disciplinary Problems relied on testimony almost exclusively from white crew members and senior Navy officers. These were carried out in closed-door hearings. When the findings were released to the press in March 1973, they were one-sided and damning. The subcommittee is of the position that the riot on Kitty Hawk consisted of unprovoked assaults by a very few men, most of whom were below average mental capacity, most of whom had been aboard for less than 1 year, and all of whom were black. The congressional report rejected any suggestion of institutional prejudice in the Navy. It blamed the violence on permissiveness in military discipline and characterized the black defendants as thugs. Not once did the report acknowledge the documented history of racial discrimination aboard the ship. Not once did it address why no white sailors had been charged, despite ample evidence of their participation in the violence. But something was happening in those San Diego courtrooms that Congress and the Navy hadn't anticipated. The defense lawyers, digging into the evidence, were uncovering a very different story. They discovered that the pre-trial investigation report contained testimony only from prosecution witnesses. They found that Captain Townsend had a documented history of biased disciplinary actions. They located black sailors who could testify to the harassment and discrimination they'd endured, but who had never been interviewed by investigators. The trials revealed the depth of the injustice. Commander Cloud took the stand and testified that the fighting had erupted when Marines, on orders to break up groups of sailors, only enforced the order against black sailors. He testified that he'd been threatened by both black and white sailors during the riot. He described witnessing a white sailor who appeared to be directing Marines toward black sailors, coordinating attacks while remaining out of direct confrontation. Then came the evidence that would later expose the entire prosecution as built on falsehoods. Michael Lawry, a white sailor who had been a key government witness, was charged with perjury after tape recordings surfaced. On those tapes, Lawry admitted that white sailors had exaggerated about the violence of black sailors. When asked outright if he had lied about black sailors in his testimony, Lawry affirmed that he had. He elaborated that despite not seeing any black sailors hit any white sailors would say they did. The tapes revealed something even more disturbing. Lawry expressed regret that he didn't have a gun that night. If he had, he said, it would have allowed him to kill at least 30 of them. He didn't say sailors. He used a slur that revealed the racist hatred underlying much of the prosecution's case. The evidence of perjury should have resulted in overturned convictions and new investigations into who else had lied. Instead, the Navy quietly buried it. Of the 25 black sailors originally charged, 21 requested court-martial trials. The trials concluded in April 1973 with a total of 27 proceedings. 7 defendants accepted plea deals, admitting to reduced charges in exchange for minimal sentences like time served or small fines. 10 were convicted at trial of one or more offenses and received minimal sentences. 6 others were exonerated. 3 had their charges dismissed before trial. 2 were acquitted. 1 was cleared on appeal. Only 1 white sailor was ever charged, and that came 3 months after the riot. He was charged with assault. At his trial, he was quickly acquitted. Among the more egregious injustices revealed during the trials was the treatment of the defendants before trial. They'd been held in pre-trial confinement for months, despite the constitutional presumption of innocence. Some spent that entire time in maximum confinement, including solitary confinement. 1 defendant attempted self-harm while in solitary. A JAG defense lawyer was even threatened with removal and court-martial himself for what a senior officer considered his overzealous defense of his clients. The Navy was making clear that vigorous defense of black sailors would not be tolerated. The fallout from the Kitty Hawk riot extended far beyond one ship. The incident triggered riots and protests on other Navy vessels in the months following the disturbance. 4 days after the Kitty Hawk violence, a group of about 12 black sailors aboard the USS Hassayampa, a fleet oiler docked at Subic Bay, told officers they wouldn't sail with the ship. Eventually 6 were charged with assault and rioting. The pattern was spreading throughout the fleet. Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, the chief of naval operations, couldn't ignore what was happening. Zumwalt, who had been trying to implement racial equality programs since taking command in 1970, recognized that the Navy had failed. In testimony before the Congressional Committee investigating the Kitty Hawk incident, Zumwalt acknowledged significant discrimination in the Navy. He told Congress that these incidents were clearly due to failure of commands to implement new racial programs with a whole heart. Addressing both the committee and the Navy's entire command structure, he emphasized this issue of discrimination must be faced openly and fully. Zumwalt issued an unprecedented order. He directed all senior Navy officers that their careers might depend on how quickly they moved to improve conditions for black sailors. He added, that he invited Navy officers who did not view improved race relations as their critical duty right now to retire from the service. It was an extraordinary statement from the service's top officer, an admission that racism in the Navy had become so endemic that it threatened the institution's ability to function. But institutional change came slowly. The black sailors who had been convicted carried their records for the rest of their lives. The Navy never conducted a serious investigation into the perjured testimony. The white sailors who had participated in the violence faced no consequences. Captain Townsend, whose biased disciplinary practices had been exposed during the trials, faced no repercussions for his role in creating the conditions that led to the riot. For 50 years, that's where the story might have ended. The Kitty Hawk riot would be remembered as an example of black violence and Navy justice, exactly as the official narrative had framed it. But Marv Truhe, the young JAG lawyer who had defended 6 of the accused sailors, couldn't let it go. After his trials ended, Truhe remained in the Navy for 2 more years, working as a judge. He started writing a book about the case, but life intervened. He left active duty and moved back to South Dakota, where he worked as an assistant attorney general before shifting to private practice. The book project was set aside, but Truhe kept 5 boxes of documents from the case. He moved from San Diego to South Dakota, from South Dakota to Colorado, and belongings came and went. Not those boxes. Inside were thousands of pages. His own case files, tape recordings, Navy investigation reports, congressional hearing transcripts, sworn statements and testimony, medical reports, trial records. For 50 years, Truhe carried those boxes through every move, unable to throw them away, knowing that someday the truth needed to be told. In 2020, as the 50th anniversary of the riot approached, Truhe finally opened those boxes. What he found made him angry all over again. For 18 months, he worked 12-hour days, sifting through documents, remembering details, reliving the story. In 2022, he published Against All Tides, the untold story of the USS Kitty Hawk race riot. The book offered the most complete picture yet of what had happened aboard the carrier and in the trials that followed. The book revealed details that had been buried for 5 decades. It documented the systematic discrimination that had created the conditions for the riot. It exposed the one-sided investigation that had ignored white participation in the violence. It proved that key prosecution testimony had been perjured and that the Navy had known about it. It showed how the Congressional investigation had been a whitewash, literally, designed to protect the institution rather than expose the truth. Most importantly, the book let the black sailors tell their story. Men who had been characterized as thugs and criminals revealed themselves as sailors who had simply reached a breaking point. They'd tried to work within the system. They'd filed complaints about discrimination. They'd sought help from their chain of command. They'd endured harassment, watched their white peers advance past them, and absorbed the message that in the United States Navy of 1972, black lives and black dignity didn't matter. The U.S. Kitty Hawk riot wasn't a breakdown of discipline. It was the inevitable result of systematic injustice. When you trap men in a floating prison of discrimination, deny them equal treatment, subject them to harassment, and then tell them they can't even walk on deck in groups of 3, you create conditions where violence becomes not just possible, but probable. The 25 black sailors who were court-martialed weren't mutineers. They were men who fought back against a system designed to keep them subservient. Some were guilty of violence during those 6 hours. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in the chaos and targeted because of their skin color. But all of them were victims of a Navy that had decided, before any investigation began, that black sailors would be the perpetrators and white sailors would be the victims, regardless of what the evidence showed. To this day, the Navy has never apologized for the one-sided prosecution. The black sailors who were convicted have never been exonerated, despite the documented perjury that undermined the prosecution's case. The white sailors who participated in the violence were never held accountable. The officers whose discriminatory practices created the conditions for the riot faced no consequences. The legacy of the Kitty Hawk riot lives in the testimony of men like Commander Benjamin Cloud, who risked his career to tell the truth about what he witnessed. It lives in the work of lawyers like Marv Truhe, who refused to let institutional injustice be buried in boxes and forgotten. It lives in the courage of black sailors who stood trial knowing the system was rigged against them, but demanded their day in court anyway. The riot forced the Navy to confront what it had been denying for decades, that you cannot build an effective military on a foundation of racial hatred, that institutional discrimination destroys morale and combat effectiveness, and that black Americans in uniform deserve the same respect and protection as their white shipmates. The changes that followed, gradual and incomplete as they were, came at a terrible price, paid by sailors whose only crime was demanding to be treated as equals. In 2023, the Department of Defense released a comprehensive study on racial disparity in military justice. The findings confirmed what the Kitty Hawk defendants had known 50 years earlier. Black service members continue to face disproportionate punishment, are more likely to be court-martialed for identical offenses, and receive harsher sentences than their white counterparts. The Kitty Hawk riot wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a disease that still infects military justice. The 25 black sailors of the USS Kitty Hawk deserve to have their stories remembered, not as a cautionary tale about discipline, but as evidence of the cost of systematic injustice. They were scapegoats for an institution that refused to acknowledge its own failures. They were punished for responding to racism with the only tools they had left after every official channel failed them, and they were convicted by a system that had already decided their guilt before the first gavel fell in San Diego. The truth took 50 years to emerge from those 5 boxes Marv Truhe couldn't throw away. But it emerged nonetheless, a testament to the persistence of justice delayed but not denied. The U.S. Kitty Hawk riot stands as a reminder that institutional betrayal leaves scars that last generations, that the fight for equality in the military was paid for by the careers and lives of black sailors who dared to demand what should have been their birthright, and that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is refusing to accept injustice wrapped in the flag. October 12, 1972. 25 black sailors were charged with crimes aboard the USS Kitty Hawk. Not one white sailor faced charges, despite clear evidence of their participation in the violence. It would take half a century for the full truth to emerge, but when it did, it revealed what those sailors had known all along. They weren't mutineers. They were victims of a system that valued order over justice and institutional protection over truth. The U.S. Kitty Hawk riot wasn't about discipline. It was about dignity. And 50 years later, those sailors are still waiting for the Navy to acknowledge what it took from them that night off the coast of Vietnam.